Okay, welcome to UTOKing with Greg. I'm really excited today to talk to a fellow psychologist, Dr. Kirk Schneider, one of the leading psychologists in existential and humanistic psychology, offering the field a vision for what we need to do given the kind of crises in society and trying to take a leadership role, potentially being our next APA president. I've enjoyed your many books. And I find you to be an inspiration for a way psychology might be going forward. So welcome, Kirk.
Thanks so much, Craig.
I know it's
wonderful to be here with you.
Hey, man, it's great to be here. And I really, I look forward to kind of us cross-talking in relationship to what psychology has been, what it might be, what it could be going forward. And what I'd like to do, though, is just start. As we mentioned, before I hit the thing, we're both clinicians. So we often look at the narrative arc of somebody's life and to orient us to understanding them. As a function of that, can you just share with the audience a little bit about your background and story and whatever feels kind of relevant to shaping you into the life you ended up leading?
Well, I was really born into psychology, Greg. I mean, literally, my father was a humanistic educator. He was a high school teacher at the time, middle school teacher, eventually became a professor of education. And I was immersed in articles and books by Carl Rogers, Abraham Maslow, Rollo May, Frank Barron, you name it, E. Paul Torrance. I mean, my dad had his fingers on a lot of these works. Because he did his dissertation on creativity in kids. And it was very much a freedom to learn sort of perspective and deep exploration into our capacity to be more than our conditioning often.
Right, of course.
So I had that background. My mother was quite unique also, and both of them, unfortunately, have passed away. My mother just passed away at 90. My dad,
I'm sorry to hear that.
About 40 years ago. But my mother she was a fashion designer, and then she became a radio and television spokesperson in the Cleveland area. And she was the leading spokesperson for the Cleveland Illuminating Company. And she was, interestingly, very attuned to psychology. Very
That's fascinating.
Thoughtful, introspective in her way, concerned about development. And we all suffered the very tragic loss of my brother when I was 2.5 and he was 7.
Oh, gosh.
So as you might imagine, that was a shattering in our whole family.
He got a rare disease. Did I see that?
A rare disease, chicken pox and pneumonia attacked him. I mean, they took him to Brigham and Women's. I mean, they did everything for months or weeks. In any case, had a huge impact on my mother, of course. I've only come to appreciate more in my later years, but she went into psychoanalysis, which is quite interesting, unusual. Again, we were a middle-class family. We lived in a working class part of Cleveland. That was another kind of, I think, important piece of my development. We were the only Jewish family in a Christian neighborhood. It was mainly Italian, German, and Catholic. So my parents were sort of mavericks in that way.
It sounds like it.
But so my mother in psychoanalysis, and then I went through a great deal of turmoil. I started hitting 3, 4. And, I had enormous anxiety, rage, all kinds of emotions came up for me. Of course, a lot around bewilderment and terror.
Right.
Of the whole death and what does that mean? I tell people I almost feel like I went through my midlife crisis at 3.
Man,
These
wow, that's
big
intense.
questions about life came up for me in a huge way.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
My mother had the wherewithal to refer me to a psychoanalyst that her analyst knew, child analyst.
Hmm.
And that, and later on when I was in graduate school, were probably the 2 most important therapeutic contacts I had in my
Wow.
life.
Okay.
They were life turning,
Mm-hmm.
probably saving,
Mm.
because I was in such bad shape at a point that my father was actually taking notes on me and concerned that I was lost. Of night terrors and fears of monsters and so on. And just
Right.
in any case, that steady, seasoned presence of this middle-aged analyst, I still remember, but more in terms of that sort of physiognomy, his presence. I don't remember a thing he said to me. And I don't think we did play therapy. I was about 5.
Right. All right.
But he treated me and respected me as a person.
Fascinating.
And I think he would ask why questions at times, but mainly would conveyed a sense of solidity. It was difficult to find in my family system.
Right.
Understandably, because of all the jarring.
Right. Of course. So it sounded like he became a stable object, a secure, stable object and presence that you were able to then internalize and give you some attachment foundation to gain some, resonance around that, relative to the chaos your system is going through.
Yes, absolutely. The stability, the presence, extremely core. And anyway, through that experience, I moved from what I would call a position of abject terror and paralysis in many ways to gradual intrigue about my situation and ability to inquire about it, to play games, or I had a whole stable of actors and actresses and plays that I was sort of working with as a kid.
Right.
I was working out my own issues. And it eventually became fascinated by science fiction. And in those days, there were great television shows. The Outer Limits, One Step Beyond, about paranormal, and Twilight Zone. So
cool.
Maybe unusual, but I found a great solace, even though I was also a little distressed by those shows. I really related to peculiar states of mind and places, people, etc.
Right. That's a really interesting point, though, the abject terror to curiosity shift. In fact, I look for that all the time, psychotherapy, to see openings where the frame from, oh my God, reject, escape, overwhelm, to what is this and what is it doing and what am I doing? That's a very, if you can help make that shift, it's a pretty fundamental one in terms of how people orient to their experience.
Absolutely. In fact, I see it as key to an existential, depth-oriented engagement where people move gradually, often from terror to the beginnings of wonder, and then back to terror often, because something happens in their lives, or with the therapist, a rupture, and it puts us back in. But then if you've got that deeply present, concerned healer with you, you can often feel disarmed enough, enough of a base to move back into the risk-taking.
Right.
And doing that psychically as well as behaviorally.
Right.
And so I think I did that with my therapist to some degree. I was able to take more risks in that relationship, but also in the outside world. And I found a relative stability I did have challenges in school for a while,
Mm-hmm.
but I really blossomed by the time I got to college and graduate school. And thankfully,
were you were you on the path of psychology sort of the whole time? Or
yes, that's the other thing. I guess I'm one of those rare people. I knew what I wanted to do.
Actually, that's me too. I did that, and by high school at least, I knew what I wanted to do.
Yeah, me
And
too.
That's it.
Kind of my trajectory since I was a kid was toward psychology, writing, creative writing especially, but philosophy. But I found that psychology put it all together for me. It was a chance to make a living, also explore, engage my fascination with people, with human experience and behavior, and to write. So I put so many of these things together. And I had a wonderful intro psych teacher, first year of college. And boy, there's nothing like that, because it went downhill from there.
Right. That's good to hear.
He applied it to contemporary issues in our own lives. And then it got, I thought, a little, I don't know, dull. It could have been so much richer, it seems to me. But then by the time I got to graduate school, and I went to pretty unique, I graduated Ohio State, and I went to a unique graduate school called the State University of West Georgia. Way out in the hinterlands of Georgia, an hour and a half from Atlanta. And it was the proteges of Abe Maslow.
Yeah. Wow.
Decided to start the school 10 years before I started, in 68.
Okay.
And it was a fascinating place, a kind of exotic place in the middle of, kind of, well, definitely bucolic and a little redneckish.
Yeah.
But the people were cool. They put up with the psych department. And, we'd have some great meals together at the local diner. It was at a woman's house. But I suffered, I had a real anxiety, a kind of a breakdown there.
In graduate school.
First few months in, I think it was a combination of things. My father had just visited. He brought his girlfriend, who was a year older than me. I thought cognitively that's okay if I deeply loved my dad. I liked her too. But I think maybe issues of the divorce, which when I was a kid, they did divorce early. So that converged with this film that I saw, that we all saw one night, called Magic. It was an Anthony Hopkins film about a deranged ventriloquist. Lord knows why that upset me, but it was, again, a converging events, and a revered professor of psychoanalysis and phenomenology gently challenged me to work at the local mental hospital. And I took that as a real kind of pressure to do this. And I was 20, just turned 22, so I was vulnerable age. I was hundreds of miles from home, in a very unusual place, away from my girlfriend. But this convergence of events led to a kind of reactivation, I believe, very early trauma, very early helplessness.
Sort of recovery of that old state of mind, huh?
I think so. And I instinctively, my dad couldn't help, his partner could not help. I instinctively called a peer who was blind, interestingly. I think of Tiresias, not the artist of Hercules, Oedipus.
Right.
Oedipus cycle. And I just intuitively sensed that she could connect, and she came over and she did connect, and she said a phrase that I know is considered little bit of a, maybe a trite phrase today, but it was very powerful for me. And that is, this too shall pass. I was shaking, I was physically shaking. I was very anxious, I had panic attacks. This too shall pass. And she gave me the name and the number of an analyst, an existential analyst in town. Very extraordinary person whom I then engaged with for the next 9-10 months.
Okay.
My time there. And that was, I would say, the most important therapeutic experience in my life. This woman had a rock solid presence, had a very strong feeling of her connecting with where I was and being interested, curious and serious about where I was. And again, the biggest lesson coming out of that work for me was the imperative need to stay with whatever was coming up for me, wherever I was. So again, presence. Being able to stay with my whole body experience, and not just something to figure out, understand intellectually, or to behave differently. I mean, we certainly did engage at some of those levels, and she was very helpful in helping me understand a lot about my family system, my mother in particular. It helped me a great deal with perspective, and this is part of my integrative connection too. But the biggest piece for me and the deepest healing was being able to literally and figuratively reoccupy parts of myself that were blocked off. And that were like those secret closets, you know.
Totally.
Those terrifying places. And so that's a lot of what we did in the office. And then I was able to take that out into the world. And I gradually overcame a number of the symptoms that I had. And it's been with me ever since. I mean, we're talking 40, almost 40 years. So over 40 years.
So it seems to me, I'll offer a basic framework that I operate from in sort of the principles of the work of psychotherapy and what it is that sort of at the core of the healing, and see if this resonates. I think it sounds like it resonates. So I think that people get trapped in intrapsychic and interpersonal cycles where they can't metabolize various forces that are inside of them. And then they develop defenses against those, and then they try to compensate and escape and repress. And that creates sort of, at least if we're not talking about the inside of an individual, just a real fragmented structure that's got a lot of energy blocking. And I mean that sort of metaphorically, but actually I think there's also maybe more than just metaphor there. And so then what I look for then is sort of, at least within the individual, sort of a developmental, knowing their history line that affords then vertical integration in the synchronic moment. So there's a diachronatic development and then the synchronic across the levels of the body, into the heart, into the rational mind, and then into the spirit in relation. And so the body is basically the physiological interoception framing of the gut, the appetites, pleasure and pain, the place in relationship. That's sort of the core animalistic way of being in the world. The heart is sort of your primate socio-emotional attachment structure, the need to be known and valued, the fear of abandonment and core rejection, sort of intuition and pride and shame and love and hate and all of that. And then you have your justifying, kind of narrating, oh my God, what's happened to me and why, and what's the implications of this? How are people going to see me? And, what does this actually mean in some sort of rational egoic sort of way? And then ultimately sort of a spiritual potential transcendent of purpose, of notions of connection to the cosmos and other kinds of sort of potential transcendent ideologies that then give meaning or not. And so that's what I call the vertical stack. And what I see in a lot of individuals then is sort of breakdowns in the coherent integrative flow between that. And so then as you transition from body into heart, or heart into mind, or mind into spirit, you get systems saying, fuck that, I don't want any of that. So then you get blocking and defense and all this other stuff. And then the fundamental question is, can you bring presence? Can you bring attention? And then how is sort of in a loving, healing context, bring curiosity, what I call calm MO, curiosity, acceptance, loving compassion, and then a healthy motivation toward valued states of being. And then that tries to then afford that light, as it were, that relational light, conscious light, tries to afford a coherent integration to bring right relationship between these various layers. How does that jive with your sense?
Well, it very much jives. I mean, I might not use the same words that you use, but I appreciate the words you're using. What comes to my mind is freedom. It's freedom summarizes my own experience path and those of many of my clients in the sense of, through the work, developing an increasing capacity to roam within and without.
Right.
Thoughts, feelings, body sensations, imaginings, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Right.
As that dilates,
I
as
love
the
that word.
capacity grows,
Right.
and with one's whole body experience, one feels less, I feel less alien
Right.
from these parts, the actual cells, as van der Kolk has
and internal family systems or whatever. There are a lot of, the different sub, whether you do subparts or whatever. Clearly, there are all these different voices and forces, right?
Lately, I got to tell you, Greg, I'm a born-again Ronkian.
Okay.
I'm immersed in Ronk's work of late. I really see that powerful thread between Ronk and Becker and terror management theory and a broader existential, humanistic, integrative view. But going back to the trauma of birth, something we all experience, the move from relative quiescence and non-existence to sudden, buzzing, blooming, confusing existence, right?
It's a pretty dramatic shift.
Roaring, yes. So it happens right from the birth of consciousness.
Right.
And I wouldn't necessarily call it the trauma of birth, but certainly the drama of birth. Because
Certainly
I think
the drama. I love that. Yeah.
Wondrous elements as well. But so it's a lot about integrating that template that either gets exacerbated through family system approaches and cultural system approaches, or is more held and supported for a person's capacity to come into the more of who they are, to experience freedom.
Yes.
So the freedom is very powerful. And I think without freedom, it's really hard to get to those later stages you're talking about, especially inner freedom. I associate it with the sense of awe, which has also been a very significant theme for me. And
and a wonderful book I might plug, A Spirituality of Awe, at the level of the kind of orientation, the cognitive, emotional, relational world orientation. It's a beautiful thing.
Thank you. Well, it's the humility and wonder, or sense of adventure toward living.
Right.
But in order to experience that, one needs to be able to feel and sense and think as freely and deeply as possible, it seems to me.
Right. Yes.
Or as concertedly as possible. And also that means being aware of one's limits and vulnerabilities.
Right.
Which I believe are integral to a flourishing individual and cultural collective.
Right. That's part of the openness is authenticity and honesty with what is.
Yes, definitely. And is critical to wisdom, it seems to me, to the degree we can understand what that is.
Right.
You gave a very eloquent description of it, and in your work, your writings as well. And I just really appreciate that the path that you're on with it, and the holistic frame that you're bringing to it. We need translations of this more holistic frame for our field, it seems to me.
Totally.
And we have so many riches to bring to bear in psychology as a whole. But our problem, as it's been for a long time, is compartmentalization. We get stuck in our little boxes and we can't see the forest, you know?
Right. Well,
and man, that's a great and imperative forest to broach.
Well, I mean, certainly all I can say is my cells are nodding. So that totally, that's as people know this podcast know, I entered into psychotherapy. I've been, pretty much trained by the undergrad. I had a lot of really good undergraduate professors, but I essentially bought the empiricist mode, sort of not gather accurate knowledge, and then we'll figure out the right things to do. I sort of would bring an egoic cognitive rationalism. I like Bandura. I like the scientific method. I was really impressed with all of our knowledge in relationship to that, and sort of kind of came in and like, yeah, people are kind of confused, but we can bring technologies of understanding that afford them, right ways of living. So that's kind of CBT engineering kind of frame of reference. And I certainly think it has value, but ultimately it has all the errors of what I would call now the errors of modernity in many ways also. So it has the power of empiricism and rationality, but at the same time, what is heart? What is art? What is awe? And what's relation? All of those kinds of things. Not that it completely dismisses, but it undervalues and overvalues procedure, instrumentality, reductive analysis of, outcome in particular kinds of ways. And it failed to afford exactly the necessity of a holding environment that appreciated a broad philosophy that upgraded our understanding of our natures, because I think that the modernist worldview, at least as it sort of like gets translated, is, well, it's just physical matter, you're bouncing around really, and you can bullshit it if you want, but that's basically what we are. It's like, oh my God, no, that's not really
right.
That's not right.
Well,
so,
I mean, as I view it, it's a map territory problem too.
Right.
We've got these wonderful, well-calculated maps of what is going on for the individual, even at the level of awe, because there's more and more research on that, a lot of experimental research, but there actually is a lot of qualitative research that needs to be tapped into more. But also in neuropsychology, we're mapping out the neurocircuitry very eloquently. We're mapping out the therapeutic process in so many ways with protocols, manuals, etc. But again, is the map of a sort of what's the word? Mechanically correct therapist, let's say, who's saying the right things based on aggregate data to this individual, the same as experiencing therapist and a therapist experiencing a client in that moment, that given client in that given moment, bring to bear the clinical knowledge that they have and the intuition that they have.
Totally.
Is the neurocircuitry of awe, and believe it or not, they have an awe circuitry at this point.
Okay.
They have a God.
Right. I've seen some of that.
Is that the same as one's experience of awe or God? Let's say, if you believe. No, there's a distance. And even though there's activation in the brain that supposedly is the same, when, let's say, somebody is walking in beautiful nature through the woods. Right. Well, the activations in the, firings of the neurons, et cetera, are supposedly the same or very similar as they are when somebody is in a virtual reality device and doing the same thing. But I think we really need to question this, Greg. We need to look much more closely. Is it the same? I don't think so, because first of all, I think we're talking about the difference between what I might call a closed system, relatively closed system of the simulacrum, the virtual reality device, let's say, and a radically open system of one nakedly standing before nature, and I mean that metaphorically and maybe literally, into the darkness of the woods, into the mystery where creation knows a lightning bolt could hit, rain could suddenly pour down, a wild animal could come out of nowhere, something psychologically could suddenly be discovered that is, it's just totally uncontrolled. There's no control. So doesn't that alone make for some kind of difference in phenomenology?
Yeah.
So I got on the rant.
Yeah, no, well, I mean, you're preaching to the choir as far as all of that goes. I mean, you know, when I think about, you know, some of the framing of modernity, my friend John Vervaeke is an integrative cognitive scientist, talks about different modes of knowing. Okay. And one mode of knowing is procedural knowing. That's basically affords you skill and to achieve through recipe. And when you do it simply, you just develop habits of just, and it affords you a way of relating to the world in closed systems where you know, the capacity to generate recipe. And for much of modernity, actually, that's kind of been the idealized frame. Like when we develop an intervention, it's like, oh, well, that's what we can specify. That's what we can manualize. That's what we can, those are then becomes an observable variable cluster that we can at least say, hey, is translatable. Okay.
Yes.
But it's controlled and complicated. Okay. Which is fine, but that's just a domain. There are other forms of knowing like perspectival, which by the way, is fundamentally for him about presence. It's essentially the grip your perceptual system has and identifies with the self-world relation, okay? And then whether it feels ingrained in that or not, or feels alienated from that, it's sort of like I really see this because I have a perceptive experience of presence and grip, okay? Another is participatory. Participatory knowing is when you drop into a totally novel system and develop a complex adaptive feedback loop in relationship to it. Okay. And that is not prescribed in terms of its algorithm. That is the ways in which things bounce back and forth based on the variables that are coming back at you. Okay. Feedback, exactly. So to me, what I saw a lot of, like with manuals are trying to get procedural knowing, because then but actually the art is the presence and participatory intuition in relation to what's going on. And it is that intuitive dance that I think that many people, and the nature of being a human is it's tracking that we lived in open societies. They got to track the capacity of a system to enter into unknown territory and demonstrate capacity for presence there to generate participatory knowledge. And that is a much more intuitive, trustworthy kind of system. Not to say that you can't rely on procedures, but people's felt sense of being are going to be tracking presence and tracking participation. And they will test the recipe. I mean, I see this all the time as like, oh, well, are you just treating me like a goddamn formula? Right? The test. And if the person the therapist then is overcommitted to procedure and can't meet the test of participation and perspective, then boom, you short circuit the whole damn thing. You know,
well, that's what our latest outcome research is saying too, right? People like Wampold and Norcross, pointing to the relational contextual factors as the most important.
That's the ground that affords It's the ground that affords the safety and the confidence and the hope and the willingness then to turn into the dark and have the capacity to actually stay present in relationship to it. And people don't trust just a mechanical, complex system. And I think for many good reasons, complicated system, because it doesn't have the intuitive uncertainty and flexibility. And to get through. So I think that we, and this is sort of an overarching shift in sort of the metaphysics of science, is much more complex, adaptive, systemic feedback loop thinking. It's more systems thinking, it's more interactive, it's more open, it's less reductive and isolating, trying to delineate, the world is like a clock, and if we understand its parts, it just unfolds in a particular way, and we need to untangle the recipe of causation. It's like, no, actually, the world is like a tree. and it moves back and forth and all sorts of different things and can flourish. And it's responding as an agent in relation in certain regards. And that especially it moves when we go into animals and get into people. That's a much, much more realistic way of framing.
I agree, but I would just like to convey a note of empathy for our, rationalistic Enlightenment direction coming out of just abject poverty and ignorance.
Beautiful. Very important point to make.
Our classical traditions, pestilence, disease, bubonic plagues in the Middle Ages.
Totally.
And the desperate need to make this a more sanitized, manageable world. And we have come a very long way since, the 1400s roughly. I mean, Michel Foucault writes about this beautifully. The Enlightenment turn, even the pre-Renaissance, we're already beginning to move toward what Heidegger calls calculative thinking for some very good reasons. The problem is, as Foucault beautifully points out, is we threw the baby out with the bathwater. So what happened to our primal experience of nature, our primal relationship to nature and the cosmos? It got severely contracted through the emphasis on manipulation and control, prediction and control, et cetera.
Beautifully said.
I guess I want to bring both to bear.
Totally, 100%.
But it also, what it means is that as we move, and I agree with you, I think psychology and the APA is also moving, perhaps not as rapidly as we'd like to see, but it is moving. I saw that in the latest therapy practice guidelines, more toward a holistic, diversified framework to relate to context. But what I think we have to prepare ourselves for, and here's another place that Rank anticipated and Nietzsche as well, is for more anxiety. We're going to have to come to terms with the natural anxiety of living more if we're going to take a more holistic, in-depth perspective toward our humanity and toward a wisdom path, it seems to me, because it means opening to places that are less predictable, less manipulable, and less, in some ways, safe, if you will.
Yeah.
You have to have some uncomfortable conversations with each other. This is happening, as we've talked about in the dialogue movement. People from different backgrounds, but it certainly needs to happen in psychotherapeutically, and as a culture, as we deal with more and more of the complexities of the technological, technocratic society imposing itself on us. Beautiful.
That's a lot of richness there. Virtually everything you said there, I can completely concur with. So absolutely in relationship to, if I sound critical of the Enlightenment, it's only because it is my home. So sort of it's in front of the,
it's my home.
It's crucial to honor that. And I try to frame the little part of a movement that I'm on as a vision towards Enlightenment 2.0. And essentially that basically builds off the first Enlightenment, which gets us all sorts of power and control and insight into aspects of the world, but throws out a baby in terms of our relational dynamics and how to live in the world. In fact, the theme of this podcast, which I'll share with you, and I think it will resonate, is that we're searching for a coherent naturalistic ontology that can revitalize the human soul and spirit in the 21st century.
Love it.
And and the idea basically is that, you know, the scientific enlightenment afforded us tremendous insight in regards, but it didn't quite capture the nature of the human in a relationship to each other, our affects, nature, how we would then frame that and inform it in terms of how it goes through this like transformation into the digital and all of that. And instead, it handed it certain kinds of things which needed to be really strong and robust. And they basically got a fragmented, chaotic, you know, piecemeal, potentially alienating frame of understanding that I think in combination with lots of other factors gives rise to what my friend John Vervaeke calls the meaning crisis, argues that we're sort of facing a breakdown in what is shared sense of what is and what is good and how to live our lives, a frame of fundamental sort of authentic existential contact with being and knowing how to cultivate purpose in relationship to that, how to home ourselves.
Maybe a moral and ethics grounded in one's whole body experience.
Beautiful, exactly, which would be a great way to frame a wisdom orientation.
I think so. Yeah, it doesn't imply an absolute truth with a capital T.
Absolutely.
So it's postmodern to that degree.
Right.
And it's also not stridently postmodern in the sense of treating every point of view as basically equivalent in some
Absolutely
way. I believe it preserves the sense of sacredness that many of us experience if we experience life with our whole body.
100%. 100%. In fact, that actually, I'm on a series called Sacred Naturalism that completely articulates that, the cultivation of the sacred, all of which is central in relationship to that process. Also in relationship to the framing of the cultural sensibility. In a number of my circles, there's an identification of this sensibility as a metamodern sensibility. So in metamodern sensibilities basically looks at modernity. It can be framed a lot of ways, but the core of it looks at modernity as a thesis in a particular way, sees postmodernity as an appropriate critical antithesis that critiques it, but then says, hey, we can get an integrated pluralism. There is absolutely the case that some of the transcendent truths and reasons of modernity overshot. They didn't take social justice and historical context in appropriate ways, and afforded just sort of hyper rational view that isn't realistic. But at the same time, it doesn't, to undercut it into hyper relativistic knowledge it's just a critique. That's not a substantive statement. So this says, hey, actually, there are ways to grab hold of certain kinds of footing, see that people see those kinds of footings from a wide variety of different perspectives. That's an integrated pluralistic sensibility that I think heals some of the postmodern divisions that we're going through right now.
I really like the metaconscious, metamodern perspectives. It seems to me that those are moving in pro-human perspectives, pro-human directions, I should say.
Definitely. That's my sense too.
On present knowledge, experience. Yeah. Absolutely.
Now, one of the things I wanted to touch in on is your leadership in the field. You have a vision for APA. You're involved in it in some training councils and other kinds of elements, and you're a candidate for the presidency, which I wish you well in and strongly endorse you for. Can you share a little bit about what you hope for psychology? You alluded to some of that, but I think it would really be helpful for us to kind of dive into this vision for what you think psychology might be doing, given all of the shit that's going on in the world.
Yes, well, the way I boil that down is, and I believe all my platforms really converge on this, is the major crisis of emotionally impoverished relationships in our country.
Beautiful.
Emotionally impoverished, emotionally stunted relationships. I see this as certainly one of the key, if not the key, psychosocial problems that we face, and that psychology has a great deal to bring to bear to the problem. Now, we see this because of, certainly the pandemic of late has exacerbated, has inflamed emotional and impoverished relationships that we're already building in the sense of, greater isolation,
Right.
alienation,
Loneliness.
loneliness. I think an excessive reliance on our devices.
Yeah.
Many, which who knows what that's going to be leading to in terms of capacity to build social skills, the capacity to develop that inner freedom that we were talking about, which requires struggle often.
Yes.
It requires being with some pretty tough parts of oneself and others, uncomfortableness.
100%. You have to get exposure to that to ground that freedom. You can't just flip a switch. You have to develop it.
That's right. And then we of course have the whole problems of many parents being preoccupied by jobs, our culture not supporting, I don't believe, optimal childcare and time to be present and connected, engaged with children. So child rearing is impinged upon. We have a great deal of emotional and physical abuse in our culture, stemming from a number of reasons, some of which we've touched upon. I think people lacking meaning, lacking a sense of awe and the gift of life. Certainly economic, economic crisis.
Inequality and stress to try to maintain the demands and the difficulty doing that. Absolutely. Instability.
Yes, people don't have time to be with each other, to cultivate relationships. Racial issues, of course, are huge as an oppressive burden for many people in cultivating fuller, more vital kind of relationships, and on and on. And so my platform is really designed around helping to shift psychology from a relative secondary priority in the country to recognizing this major crisis as a top priority. And I would do this by, first of all, fostering the healing dialogues that I've been very involved in as a trained moderator for Braver Angels, which is a grassroots citizens movement that started on the eve of the election of Trump because of so much divisiveness that was happening at the time. It started by a psychologist, Bill Doherty, from University of Minnesota, bringing humanistic and couples counseling and other psychological principles to bear to help to bring self-identified liberals and conservatives together for living room style conversations in a highly structured, supportive format that lends itself to the attainment of greater common ground by the end. And I have witnessed this personally and been very moved by it, and research upholds it as well, growing research. And I have drawn from that work, and also a dozen or so years prior to that, I was developing what I call the experiential democracy dialogue, point of the Iraq War, because there's a similar kind of divisiveness in the country. And I thought, look at all the riches we have to bring society and out of the office, really needs to be brought out. So I developed that framework, and that is really focused more on a one-on-one, intimate meeting between people of a whole variety of backgrounds, religious, non-religious, different races, classes, liberal, conservative, etc. And so in any case, I have a whole 6-phase model and I've been promoting it in webinars. I have one coming up with Wright Institute, actually. September 11th, strangely.
Interesting.
And so a lot of my mission in life right now is to give these tools away. I wrote the book, The Depolarizing of America.
Yes, I was going to mention that. Good. I'm glad you brought that up.
That's where I've summarized a lot of my experiences with this. And it's really a lot about giving psychology away.
Right.
I'm attempting to do that. So that's one platform, and I would promote that with the profession. I believe we need a WPA, a Works Progress Administration style funding.
Let me pause you for just a sec there, because I want to stay. This polarization issue is so central. Let's sort of double click on that for a little bit and say, sir, I've actually been involved with Michael Mascolo building. Creating common ground so I just share. I've been involved what's called Intergroup Dialogue as a particular process for this. To me, this polarization issue, in the absence of meaning, I think what's essentially happened is our politics now is almost taking the place of our religion, and the confusion about our identities is such that people now are investing them. And the nature of the structural systems that are involved, like social media, the nature of the way our current system is defined by the two parties in a particular way, some of the changes that have taken place over the last 20 years in the political arrangements, we really have poured a structural system for sort of, nobody designed it this way exactly, but basically to emphasize microphones on the hyper extremes that really then flood our consciousness and essentially force individuals, even though the majority of people are sort of in the center or more moderate in their general orientation, to get salient leaders that are really defined against one another and then framed in relationship to a win-lose team, almost warfare, info warfare kind of structure. I just think it's really important for people to understand, at least that the potential destructive nature of this and the levels that it's reached are, and people get it, I think, in terms of the way they live, but fundamentally we're basically participating, I think, in a maladaptive, feedback loop of vicious cycles across a wide variety of different domains. And the psychotherapeutic thing is, hey, if you're involved in a vicious, nasty cycle, just become aware and accept that you're sort of in it, and also stop. Stop digging, it's like, do what you can to try to get out of. And that's why I actually really like identifying metamodern. And I'll basically say, listen, I've always been on the left side of the political spectrum, but the energy to advocate for left and diminish right is basically, to me, in a hyperpolarized state, essentially adding to sickness in relation. And so I'm definitely somebody who really I just really wanted to echo the work and the effort and the vision and the wisdom from psychology you potentially bring to bear on this is really central and crucial. And I think it's a very, very important point. So I just want to thank you for your efforts and your leadership and your vision in that regard, because, it's one of the things that I think is contributing or a product of the meaning crisis. And it's to turn that around to create a constructive dialogue around leadership and where we might be headed in the future is really crucial to get the institutions back in a functional way and to get our hearts back in a relational world in a way that is much, much healthier. So that's my little spiel on that, but just thank you.
Beautiful. And it applies to institutions. It doesn't only apply to just everyday citizens. I think you can apply this model to the work setting where people have these kinds of tensions. Certainly in classrooms, the educational setting, and at the legislative, diplomatic settings as well. Yes, we as psychologists have so much to bring in terms of dealing with otherness, right? I mean, what are we particularly good at generally? Well, especially psychotherapists, but also people in applied psychology, we're good at being able to be present to others, active listening, creating a safe working space where people can begin to, as you say, metabolize their terrors, their fears of otherness, because that's a lot of where I believe these polarizations come out of.
I totally agree.
Some great terror of an anxiety about not mattering, about insignificance, ultimately perhaps a kind of death anxiety, of groundlessness in the universe. And of course, these take major interventions over the long run, but in the shorter run, there's a lot we can bring in helping people to develop a more mindful, a more present approach to their fears of the other. One of the ways I do this in the experiential democracy dialogue is before anyone even jumps in with discussion of an issue, I invite them to envision what it might be like to encounter this other person with the other point of view. They've already chosen other points, or they've already chosen a charged issue. So what it might be like to just sit with them. What kind of feelings, sensations, images come up for you? And can you more or less observe those without fixating on any particular one, but just notice what comes up for you, and then see if you can clear a space for the human being that's before you.
Beautiful.
As opposed to the label or the stereotype or your knee-jerk reaction to that person, what they represent. Can you see a person with a personal story who may be wounded, who has a family, who has a dad and a mom, friends, is vulnerable, etc. And this is, I've found, many people have found that this is a very powerful priming.
Beautiful.
For moving toward engaging. And then I have people discuss where they came from. Talk to your partner about what it was like to grow up in your family system, and how is the other, whoever the other is in that conversation, treated by your family system. So you're putting it out on the table. And then begin discussing your stance. And having the partner reflect back what they heard, and the original partner be able to correct that. And then going into what I call what Braver Angels calls a stereotypes exercise, where people are actually, first of all, they're identifying the stereotypes of them toward themselves by people critical of them.
Good.
Let their partner clearly know the kind of pain that they've experienced in those stereotypes. Whatever it is. And they can be pretty brutal, as you know, both. And then the speaking partner identifies the false and misleading aspects of those stereotypes, so they get to fill out more of the human picture of what they're about. And then they identify the nuggets of truth to the stereotypes. Which is a way, again, of humanizing the conversation, of making oneself more vulnerable, more accessible to the other. It's rounding out the picture. And then they go into a phase where they can ask a question of each other. All of this, by the way, is predicated on ground rules. You can't, you really got to try to come from a place of curiosity and respect, if only it's respect for the person being willing to engage with you. But curiosity as opposed to presumption, or certainly accusation, belittlement. So your question needs to come from that, an open question, honest curiosity, a genuine interest in how is it that you see it this way? And then the final phase of discovery results. What did you both learn about each other, about oneself? And was there any room for common ground? Maybe even actionable common ground. Where do you go from here? Well, clearly these conversations can continue, they can deepen, but my feeling is psychology and psychologists are in a prime position to really move these across the country, at least make them available. I'm not talking about some bureaucratic imposition, but funding for many of us to be able to spread this out in the country and make it available at a number of these levels and places. I would also call for what I call a relational equity task force to identify how we can bring more emotionally reparative relationships, more quality, in-depth, emotionally reparative relationships all across the board in the country, but in particular in underserved and minoritized communities. It's so severely lacking. And we try our best in public mental health, but I think many of us know and have benefited from, we've been fortunate to benefit from really substantive and often, frankly, longer term relationships with healers that can help turn our lives around.
Right.
And I think this is so critical in addressing
Totally.
everything from the kinds of physical abuse and emotional abuse and crime rates that we see, racism, extremism that's rampant, not to mention the so-called pathologies of depression, anxiety, addiction,
Totally.
which are rampant. So, yeah, bringing our wisdom to bear in making more available longer-term, emotionally reparative relationships in the country. Then I would also call the leaders of the specialties of the APA at a council session to come together and talk about how their specialty can best address the psychosocial crises that we face. We collate that information and we disseminate it to our profession and to the public.
Beautiful.
Maybe a paper comes out of it.
Right.
And then finally, I call for a federal office, a federal office of psychological consultants to address 24/7 and concentrate on 24/7 the psychosocial crises of our times, which again often relate to emotionally impoverished relationships.
Right.
And can amplify and expand the voice, the advocacy voice of APA, which is doing a terrific job. It is moving the ball forward. But there's nothing like, for example, the AMA has the Surgeon General. It often has medical folks at the head of SAMHSA, for example.
Right.
Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration, NIH, et cetera. What do we have in the psychosocial realm? At the head, I'm talking about the lead.
Right. A
bringing
position of voice.
experts in psychosocial mediation, both at mental health level and organizational level.
Beautiful.
So that's a big plan. I mean,
I love that plan. So it sparked a couple of things in me. So in terms of bringing sort of knowledge, how do we bring our knowledge? The way you laid out sort of like, how do people get trapped? How do they get polarized? How that gets dysfunctional? I love that. If I were consulting, some of the things that I would bring is one thing I'd bring is this idea of justification systems. Okay. So our propositional knowledge structure is structurally, functionally organized to justify. And if we're feeling defensive, we get narrowly possessive in a sort of cognitive dissonance sort of way that we're justified, and anybody that's against us then is a threat. And then that creates fear. And then we want to justify why we're all right and those guys are losers, and that's the default position when we're agitated. And to help people, when you get stuck into a system of justification, a position, and then immediately polarize somebody else, you'll then activate exactly the opposite place, and both systems of justification will drive themselves into particular. And the issue is to become metacognitively aware of that, and then cultivate the processes that sort of prevent the unnecessary destruction of the default into, hey, I'm justified, you're not, and you're a bastard, and blah, 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 right?
This is what I call the vicious cycle of polarization.
Exactly.
And actually, some of the latest research with ex-members of extremist groups, both religious and cultural, the RAND Corporation did one recently, indicates that these ex-members home in on one major factor, and that is lack of exposure to diversity, both growing up, in terms of diversity of ideas, diversity of people, and certainly within their sort of tribal silo, right? And so one of the the issues, the themes that was associated with their breaking out of these groups was being exposed to an other.
Right.
And finding out that they're not the demons that they were pumped up to be by their family, their cultural systems, or their charismatic, quote unquote, leaders.
Totally.
And in their fears, the fears which have driven them to identify with these extreme folks as well.
Right.
They put a lot of those fears at rest. Fear of insignificance, of not mattering. They see that this other does relate to them, maybe in a decent way or caring way. They have their own vulnerabilities, their own humanity. So again, it points back to the need to have these uncomfortable but often very rewarding conversations across the silos, across the lines.
Beautiful. So that's a wonderful articulation of that dynamic. I love the vicious cycle. Go ahead.
One other quick thing is, the other thing I wanted to echo with what you were saying is, what they also said was that the people being critical of them in a very didactic and kind of condescending, parentified way just drives them that much more.
Totally.
To
that system.
To their extreme.
Sit down, basically. Yeah. The other thing that came to mind, I tell the story because I think it speaks to sort of what I hope we evolve to, and it speaks exactly, I think, to the entire message that grounds your speaking of emotionally impoverished relationships. And that is, I tell how I developed this thing called the influence matrix. It's actually the fourth key idea in UTOK. And what it does is it maps the human relationship system. And it says, hey, we humans intuitively create self-other matrices, and we track the processes by which that self-other dynamic unfolds on dimensions of power, on love, and on freedom. Initially, I called it the influence matrix because I was coming from an evolutionary psych view, and it was basically, hey, the underlying motive is to, have the capacity to influence others in accordance with your interests, okay? Which is valid, but it's framed initially as a very instrumental framing. It's like, hey, I can move you around, okay? And in the world of evolution, there's certainly some truth to that. If you can move them around, that's good. If you can get food, that's good. But it's definitely, if we do a from thing, it's definitely the doing mode at one level. And it speaks to sort of our economic and educational structure. What's the outcomes? What's the product? What's the money? That kind of thing. Over the time, as I really track people's motive as a clinician, okay, this thing evolves from the social influence as sort of the key into what I call relational value. All right. So relational, because what I saw, many people, yes, if you had no interest and no influence and no value, or at least you either perceived that or really had that, you felt like shit and you came in lonely, alienated, and that's a brutal thing if you're an 8-year-old kid getting rejected, and then you carry that. That's clear. But many individuals had influence, okay, but did not feel known and valued at all. And they felt valued in relationship to just what they could do because they put on a persona. Okay. Hey, I can do this, but people don't know me. If they really knew me, okay, they would then maybe reject me. So I have to fake it. And then that creates a very empty heart and a fear that you'd be discovered as the imposter syndrome. Okay. Right. And so ultimately over time, it basically is like what the heart seeks is not just social influence, although that's important. That's the instrumental aspect. It seeks the being aspect of being known and valued for what it is, and being held with honor and respect and dignity for its core. And if you hold that in honor and respect and dignity, that feeds the heart in relation. And it actually then also affords lots of flexibility on what we believe and what we're doing. So getting that message out, that in fact, that the calories for the heart is to be known and valued by important others. That's really, and of course, many people have said that, but ultimately trying to really, if I look out across the educational structure and, what would it be great to have a, Surgeon General of Psychology being actually the core social motivation of being known and valued, and that should be fused. And if you're just instrumentally relating to people, people resent the hell out of that, basically in many ways. They feel manipulated, they feel alienated. And that's our capitalist structure really affords a huge amount of this at the level of instrument without at the level of relation. And so that would be another message that I would encourage. And of course, that's all embedded in all of what you're saying, but you could just imagine what it would be to have, councils together and then to be able to release foundational assertions about the human condition and what does it mean and what is it, the famine, the relational famine that we're going through and why. It's just I think you're offering just beautiful ideas in relation.
Yeah, beautifully put. What if we could bring a core of therapeutically attuned people out to communities, to classrooms, to again work sites, legislative settings, etc.
Totally.
To offer these kinds of models to people. Some are going to back away and think it is too bureaucratic, whatever, the government imposing itself. But I think, like you say, a lot of people hunger for this. And once they see it, they recognize the gold that's in it. Whereas our system, as you say, our whole socioeconomic system is so predicated on the contrasting in so many ways. And that's a big frustration and challenge. The emphasis on speed, instant results, and appearance and packaging is so much of our system. We get rewarded for those things.
No, it's an instrumental, right. The contingencies are structured to push those levers, but we have to figure out, in my estimation, if we're going to evolve, we can already see the impact of that. If we had authorities that afforded the capacity to extract and organize and consolidate the knowledge that psychology has, the science is pretty damn clear on this. And I so often, even my students will do this. Will be like, they'll be talking, they'll be like, oh, well, I'm more humanistic. I really like the relationship. I was like, that's science, That's the science of the field. It's, right, I know, but we split these things. You just hear it in the categories of, oh, well, and you see sort of the prediction and control and technologies being science, and then this, mushy humanistic stuff over here, and the artists kind of like it. It's like, no, folks, like that's the architecture that we actually need to overcome and realize that the nature of our embodied behavioral being, and I'll use the word behavioral to pull in the science, the nature of embodied behavioral beingness fundamentally is really about this. We have to have the being and becoming mode fused in our soul, or else it's going to feel really empty. And I really anxious to try to get that message out there. And that's why, if we can do that, that would be great.
Yes. Well, let's try our best. Remember that book by Amadeo Giorgi quite a few years ago? Psychology and Human Science.
Yes.
Well, he focused on phenomenology in particular, but I think that can be seen more broadly within the holistic framework that we're suggesting.
Totally. In fact, actually, I remember that book. My only critique is actually we need human psychology, because actually the reason we need to add the human, it's not redundant, is because behavior and mental process, at least from my vantage point, properly defined, is actually just at the animal mental level. And then there's the human, and that's where the core of the field is trying to organize, but that splits off into natural science. And human psychology jumps into philosophy, into the social inquiry, into the psychotherapeutic elements. And that let's embrace that. And that's the intersection of all that. And that's really at the root, from my vantage point, it sits right at the heart of the meaning and mental health crisis, this issue of human psychology and cognitive science and what it is, and the science and therapeutic knowledge that we've cultivated, and then how to, in fact, I gave up my license this year because I gave it up because I wanted to really shift, although I love psychotherapy. I really see this as a sociocultural level analysis, and that is and really the wisdom of the therapy room that we figured out, which of course is super appropriate. And I train people, and I want psychological doctors and healers to be professionals in context. It's actually, how do we extract the wisdom of the therapy room and put it into families and put it into societies and schools and communities, and bring this real the lessons of authentic relationality and openness and freedom for emotional processing and that kind of way of being in the world to the life quests that we are all on across all the various facets of being. So
yes, what if we put an emphasis, President Biden or Vice President Harris, an equal or an emphasis on psychosocial care and in the emotional infrastructure as much as we're putting on the physical infrastructure of the country. What if we devoted as much funding to all all the riches of what our specialties in psychology can bring from organizational health to mental health, as we do to funding, many medical, neurological research projects from the NIH or the NIH, for example. Can we put an equal priority, at least an equal priority, on something that is literally killing us in this country, as much certainly as the medical and physical aspects?
100%. 100%. And in fact, yeah, I love that. And in fact, that's we look out, we've achieved a huge amount of control over the physical technological world. We've achieved a huge amount of control over the biomedical world. And those things then got institutionalized as the control. And then this whole issue of psychosocial and its relationship to living is enormously ambiguous. And to me, Enlightenment 2.0 will afford the philosophical scientific clarity of its place, and then afford that in relationship to the institutional leaderships and the magistrate to make it real and make it on its own. So you don't stick it under medicine. That's not, if you force it under medicine, you are going to corrupt the entire concept. It's not about broken biology that you are addressing here. It's about the patterns of being in the world in relationship to each other. And that's just a different level of analysis. And we need to figure out a way to get people clear. And I think this is when I do critique Enlightenment 1.0. It didn't have a framework. It didn't have a coherent framework that afforded us the psychological level down into animals and then up into humans and into the social level, and afford us a clarity, a metaphysical, ontological clarity of that domain with integrity. And so we can speak about it and then tell people, there's real issues of being known and valued. Okay, your experience as a 5-year-old, you have an attachment system, it's freaking out, you're panicking in a particular way, you get mirrored by another that you trust, and all of a sudden that's a psychological phenomenon that creates a completely different structure of your organism down into your cells over time. And that right. And it's not to reduce it to the brain. That's not just your brain then was fired. No, actually, it was the whole dynamic system. Your brain got rewired as a function of being in the holistic system. And we have to have a holistic view that can go down into parts as necessary, but go up into, where are you in the societal system? And where are we in the cosmos, for the love of God? All of that needs to, we need coherence around that. We're desperately lacking. But if we get it, then people, I think, will understand, and then they'll see the logic of it in a particular kind of way. And that would unlock a lot of, pent up potential for us to move in this direction.
Yeah, and I like what you suggest about rebuilding our ethical approach as well. We're regrounding an ethics. And it seems to me that a more humanistic ethics would naturally emerge when people feel more fulfilled in their self and other relating, and when they feel more at home in the universe, if you will. Yes,
totally, 100%. I love that framing.
How many people, feel like they don't belong in existence from the get-go in terms of the messages they've got?
Totally.
So, and how can that affect somebody's trajectory in life? So, all these things go together. They clearly impact things like pollution and climate change as well, environment.
Right. No. Right. And that just speaks to a whole nother systemic level of need of awareness and a fundamental requirement of shift in terms of the rules that society is playing by, if it's going to maintain itself and foster flourishing, as opposed to kind of slings and arrows and potentially real genuine degradation, which is what I kind of feel in the next decade or two is a really important sort of kairos, or the core of the moment here, what we do here in these times and how we respond to the crises has enormous amount of, at least that's my felt sense, it's an enormous amount of impact of if enough of us pull together and enough of us are able to honor the developments of the past, recognize what needs to be changed, come together, make it with integrity, honesty, humility, but oriented towards the core values across a wide variety, then gosh, that potential is great. And if we don't, then it feels kind of scary.
Totally agree. We need a radical paradigm shift, and psychology has a hell of a lot to contribute to that. And we need to do it now.
Beautiful, right? Radical paradigm shift now with
Yes.
humility and reflection, but at the same time,
Yes,
it gives
yes, I don't want
it's that dialectic of that.
Yeah.
So as we, I really enjoyed the overview. Where are you feeling in terms of, as you look out at the kind of the horizon of the future in terms of where we are? Do you wake up with optimism? Do you wake up with pessimism? Is it a mix? Are there certain things
I very much echo Viktor Frankl in being a tragic optimist.
Okay.
So I do tend to be optimistic.
Good to see your existential core. That's a beautiful.
Yeah, my roots are going. But yes, I tend to be optimistic in part because I love life, and I feel that as long as I have a breath in life, there's possibility, there's hope, and there are others such as yourself who, see these problems and see needed directions. But then some of my more pessimistic friends or colleagues do have sobering messages about where we are right now. And so I waver between that and the other. But basically, let's put it this way. I feel optimistic to the extent that I have breath and energy, and I feel very blessed at 65 to still have a good deal of breath and energy.
Beautiful.
To do every damn thing I can to promote this new possibility, this reemergence of our society, of our world. And so that's where my main optimism is.
Great.
Is doing it.
Right. Embodying. I love that, because that's certainly the amount of parallels and synchronicities are affirming for me. So yeah, I certainly have the fear and can feel, and if I shift into pessimism and look out across, what feels, I kind of like, I'm a flea on a Titanic. That's my pessimistic narrative. It's like, and then at the same time, it's like, well, maybe a bunch of us fleas can get together and turn that wheel, and all of a sudden miss the thing, and the whole thing build a cruise ship or whatever, and so at times I certainly feel both of those strongly. And at the same time, in terms of my own little local garden, I have such gratitude for my health and my position and privilege, and the fact that I get to connect with folks, brilliant visionary folks who are also passionate. There really is one-on-one. There's so much good in this world, as far as almost everybody I connect with, I really believe that's another message. There's a good book, Humanity, that came out that basically really says, wait a minute, we're fundamentally pro-social. It's the right way to characterize us is this caring and wanting to give, as long as the dynamics of fear and tribalism, are attended to in a particular way. So we certainly have tribal fear potential. And then when we do that, we can become pretty evil and brutal, clearly. But our default, as long as we're safe, is love of the other. And that to me is something to be, I believe that at least. And I think there's a lot of good reason to believe that it's the defense. If we can, it's part of the message that I hope we're able to convey going forth. And so anyway, bottom line is, yes, I get up, I get energized. As long as there's breath in me, it makes good. I feel super fortunate to be part of that system and connecting with folks like you that are, really leading the charge on these kinds of things. I think you've done a wonderful job.
So what can we do to make this happen, Greg?
Well, that's,
We're doing it. I know
we're doing it. I mean, listen, as I tell folks, my talents are with theory. So I'm like real, I have a special talent with theory. I can see big picture and I can create a coherent picture. I'm sort of the anti-marketer. I'm clueless about music and marketing. Unfortunately, I'm basically learning disabled on both of those accounts. And I need other folks that have those talents. And so it's really fundamentally, it's getting folks that have various threads in this weave that we can weave together and create a tapestry based on all of our capacities. And that's what I feel is the tip that's happening, how it's going to happen and at what extent and what's the development. I have some notions, but it's really an unbelievably creative emergent process.
I think we are weaving the web, if you will, weaving the tapestry. Yes, I think we're weaving the tapestry.
So. All right. Well, Kirk, thank you so much for coming, for all your efforts, for your leadership, for your vision and sharing that with our listeners. I really enjoyed getting it, and it does make me feel hopeful that you're out there in the world doing your thing.
Well, I feel very much likewise, Greg.
So
this has been terrific.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and thanks for sharing.